This is Apple and Lace, how to paint a watercolor still life. I'm starting with a line drawing, and for my first wash, I'm using Winsor yellow, and I'm going over everything except the white cloth. I'm using a big hockey or hake wash brush. It covers a lot of area. While the yellow's still wet, I'm taking my red, alizarin crimson, and washing over the same area. You can see where the wet on wet kind of runs together. Layering your colors will give you really rich, dark colors. And you're going to see me layer colors again and again in this video. That's how I achieve the realism. I don't have to be terribly careful with these edges because I can clean those up at the end. Now the first two layers are done, and I'm going to dry this completely. For the third layer, I'm using the ultramarine blue, and I'm going to go around the apple. It's a little hard to get the exact edges with that big brush, so I'm switching to a medium brush. But I'm working fairly quickly. To do a big wash, I'm going to start at one side and work my way around, and I don't go back into the area that I've washed before. I don't keep going over and over it. I just wash it and keep going as I bring the color down. This looks really dark, but when it dries, it's going to be a little bit lighter. I want it to be very dark and rich. So once it's completely dry and I evaluate, I mix up the blue, red, and yellow into a darker puddle and give it one more coat. Just working quickly and using my medium-sized brush. I did not go over the apple with the blue. Once again, I dry this completely. And I'm going to put the shadows on the white cloth. I mixed up a watery combination of the red, yellow, and blue. And I'm going to be putting shadows or water to let the shadows blend over most of the white cloth. I'm going to put white on it at the very end, and the white won't really stand out unless you have a little hint of color at the bottom. So I'm going to lay on some neutral shadow colors. I'm working on dry paper, and then I clean my brush out and fill in the rest of the color, the rest of the unpainted white areas with just clean water. You notice I'm trying not to touch the edges where the dark blue is, because that might bleed back into my water. When that's dry, I give the shadows I want a little darker another coat. I mixed up my neutral tint with a little more red and a little more paint to make a bit of a darker shadow, darker and warmer. And once again, I lay my shadows on, and if I want them to spread, I take clean water and just touch the edges. While that's drying, I'm going to give the apple another layer. I start by mixing the red with the dark neutral color to make a really dark shadow at the bottom. I put it on and soften the edge with a small brush in clean water. Bring in some darker red for that shadow that comes down diagonally. You don't have to get your shadows right the first time or the second time or even the third time. If you're not doing the light watercolor wash, but you want some really full color realism, you may have to paint something as many times as it takes, 7 times, 10 times. Maybe you want to keep counting this video and see how many times we paint that apple. While the apple's drying, I go back and dot in just some tiny dots to suggest lace on the edge of the white cloth. For the cutout areas, I'm using my dark mix. Oops, that's spreading a bit. And just kind of drawing them in on with the brush. Now the apple's dry and I come in with another layer. I'm using more red and filling in where I see red, and then I mix the red with a little yellow and water so it's a little thinner and warmer. Give it a little variety. Back to the darker red. I go right deep. These are all transparent colors, so I can go right over top my last layer. I'm leaving an area for a highlight. And I add a little more color to that shadow, and then soften the edges with clean water. I bring a little dark down under the shadow too, and make the bottom shadow even darker. While it's still wet, I'm working wet on wet to paint the dark shadow a second time. And I put a little dark at the top of the apple in front of where the stem is going to be. Once again, don't try to get it perfect. Just get as much done in one wash as you can. Soften edges where you need to. And here I'm using a damp brush to reactivate the paint and lift up where I want the stem. While that's drying, I'm taking my Pro White, that's a white ink that works really well with watercolor, and putting a little dot of it where the highlight will be. The apple's still wet, so that's blending in. And I put a dot at the end of the stem. Now you can use the Pro White to clean up any edges you don't like, whether it's on the cutout places, if you look at the photo closely, you'll see the cutout places actually do have a bit of highlight around them. Or I can use it fairly thick to make this really white right up by the apple where the sunshine would be hitting. The Pro White is slightly blue, it's a little cool, but it blends well with my watercolor. And it's great for cleaning up and softening edges. And I think it has a nice look. Now that the apple is about dry, I come back in and I make the shadow coming diagonally once again a little darker. I'm not painting the entire apple again. I'm satisfied with a lot of that color. But I want the shadow darker. This painting's nice because you have a small area you can futz with and the rest of it turns out well. Once the apple's dry again, I use a damp brush to lift up some speckles. When I looked at my photo, I saw a lot of orange speckles, yellowish dots. Your apple may be an entirely different color if you're working from real life, but those little touches are nice to add. So I lift up a few areas and put in some yellow. And on the light areas, I just stripe the yellow right in. I dab them with the paper towel to soften them up. Tweak the stem just a little bit, and there's our apple. I just can't control myself. I'm giving the shadow one more layer. I want it to be really dark and dramatic. And there you have it, an apple and lace. I hope yours turns out every bit as nice as mine did. Happy painting!